Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello. My name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 113. With our document today, the short piece of writing that set the tone for the myths, the founding myths of America, and simultaneously acted as a quote-unquote shot across the bow of the entire Western European world of the late 18th century. A document that has become, over the long course of time, almost 250 years, a much quoted exclamation of human principles from would-be revolutionaries all the way to totalitarian dictators. They all, to a man and a woman, and yes, I'm looking at you, Eva Perón, quote extensively from these august words. As a matter of fact, I'm willing to bet that if this whole current fourth turning that we are in doesn't quite work out in the positive for the West in general, and for the United States in particular, that we will still all be chasing the sentiment, if not the actual voice of these words, until Jesus himself even returns. Today, we will analyze, as we do every year in the month of July, the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson and the rest of his crew of the founding fathers of the United States of America. And of course, we're going to be doing this on the podcast today with our regular guest co-host, during the month of July, a month that one of my other guest co-hosts says belongs exclusively to him, Dorollo Nixon Jr., Esquire. Welcome back to the podcast, Dorollo.
Good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good. How was your... we're already a little bit past July 4th when we're recording this, but how was your July 4th?
It's great. It's a great day itself and a great weekend. It was basically family focused, and we don't do fireworks.
Oh, okay.
Not that we're adverse to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really our thing. But anyway, so, we see the massive tents set up in parking lots in Phoenix, Arizona, where we live, where people are, buying their fireworks. But and we'll hear some, being shot off by the neighbors. But this year, the story was about the heat. So we spent part of the weekend in Prescott, Arizona, which is not spelled the way it's pronounced. It is the former capital of the territory of Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has an older infrastructure, but it happens to sit above where Denver sits in terms of elevation.
Oh.
And thus we shaved about 15 to 20 degrees off of the heat. And so we got to get up there with the kids, and there was a festival that was quite enjoyable. So
that's awesome.
How was yours?
I watched the fireworks from my backyard, which is great. And my kids got into the pool, which is also great. And now currently, this will date this podcast a little bit. Hurricane Beryl has now officially fallen upon land in Texas, and Houston is being flooded out, which is nowhere near where I live. That's like 5 hours away. But the rain coming off of the hurricane has reduced the temperature by about 20 degrees. Because the story here is the heat as well. It's 103 degrees in the shade. We just call that July in Texas. So, yeah. But yeah, it was nice watching the fireworks from my backyard. And actually, I'm getting ready to move out into the county, out of the city, And so the shenanigans will be even more outrageous next year. So it's going to be great. It's going to be fabulous.
Yep.
By the way, you said you're not a fireworks guy. That's a little weird to me. How did you never get the
Yes.
fire bug as a kid? How did that never happen to you?
I always saw them as kids, and it was fine. See them at baseball games, see them, 4th of July, whatever. New Year's and 4th of July, I guess, are the big times of the year when they would go off. We wouldn't really watch them for New Year's, but for 4th of July, we certainly would. We would travel downtown, and I remember that. And I can picture it right now, actually, in Rochester, New York, the games you have to play where you have to park and you get good visibility. I remember all of that. But frankly, I don't know. It's just, post college, probably even during college, it wasn't my thing. And then, of course, as you know, I spent most of the decade, almost half the decade after that, living abroad. And so fireworks are a little different in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And they still go off. You see, the New Year celebrations throughout the globe. Everyone, popularizes. Not even the case for being visible to non-residents, I would say, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But yeah, so I don't know. It's just, it's funny, but it's definitely a thing. And, I'd be more inclined to fire up model rockets than fire up fireworks.
Right.
We'll see how that changes through fatherhood, right? So.
Yeah. Well, I will say that my boy, my youngest, we usually go over to friends' houses out in the county and light off fireworks, and he is quite enamored with the idea of and the practice of lighting it and then running screaming away as it goes off behind him.
Yeah.
In a blaze of glory, and then he turns and he goes, oh, and then he's like, he's right back at it. So he's he's back into it again. So, hey, look, you know what? And then I sit by the fire and I do nothing, and it's great. I have no responsibility there whatsoever. So other than making sure that my kid doesn't light on fire.
Yes, because you live in the county.
Because I'm going to live in the county. Yes. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because it is literally still the Wild West in Texas when it comes to the county versus the city. And so you can do whatever you want in the county. There's no rules. You can literally build whatever you want. There's no code in the county, which is a whole other kind of dynamic that, I don't even want to get into, but it creates challenges when you're trying to buy a home or build a home. But anyway,
it's the pursuit of happiness, right? To each his own.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't want to conform to GFIC codes on your electrical outlets and your house might burn down, who cares? That's a decision you made. Yeah. Welcome to the county.
Exactly. So yeah, it's I think Arizona shares that, where there's certainly a city county dynamic, without a doubt. And we live in the largest city in Arizona, which also happens to be the 6th largest city in the country. But anyway, there's definitely that dynamic. But the notion that, hey, you're in the county, so you're just going to do things how you want. That's definitely an Arizona thing. It's definitely in the DNA. And yet there's a few twists that make Arizona, Arizona. And so, I think the county stuff is more high strung here than in Texas.
Yeah.
My sense of Texas is that there's a whole lot of county, but when it comes to county, people are all pretty much walking in the same direction. Whereas when it comes to county in Arizona, any direction at all.
Any direction at all.
And what really intrigues me is that even in the city, people who are actually from here, which is not us and not very many people we know, most of the people we know and engage with and interact with aren't from here. We do have some good friends, some actually quite close, who are from here, who were raised here. But most of the people we interact with are also incomers, right? So the ability of people from Arizona to accept what somebody else is doing
Mm-hmm.
whether or not it affects them, because there's an Arizona mentality that is really, you're just doing your own thing and everybody accepts it. And it fascinates me because I'm not used to that. I'm used to, you fall on one side of the aisle or the other, and you're hostile to the people on the other side, and that's it.
That's
And
it.
so
Yeah.
when you're socializing, there's no general, embrace of, oh, you're doing something different, or there's none of that. It's, what's wrong with you, XYZ. And it doesn't matter which side you're on. The phraseology seems, if that's a word, seems to be the same. The diction is the same. The word choice is the same. And it's just switching of issues or values or what have you. So
Yeah.
it's something refreshing about Arizona,
Okay.
that people genuinely seem to be, accepting of the idea that people are going to come here and live the way they wish. And that's
Yeah.
it.
Well,
So the pursuit of
the
happiness.
pursuit of happiness. Well, let's get into the pursuit of happiness. Let's get into the Declaration of Independence. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress voted to dissolve the connection between this country and Great Britain, declaring the United Colonies of North America to be free and independent states. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed toward light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Those are the iconic first couple of paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. There's several things in there that I want to talk with Dorollo about today, several different ideas that are wrapped up in here that do indeed make the Declaration of Independence the number one, well, it's a mission statement, or even vision statement, actually vision statement of a country. And I do believe firmly, as I said in the opening there, that we will be quoting these words all the way until Jesus returns. There's something that rings out about the ideas that are embedded deeply in the Declaration of Independence that stirs the heart of the totalitarian and stirs the heart of the revolutionary and stirs the heart of the patriot all at the same time. It has been said by others, not from the United States, that our culture, our governmental operations, and even our approach to citizenship is driven by a species of irrational chaos. Most recently, the Canadian author, speaker, and podcaster and clinical psychologist, Dr. Jordan Peterson, said this. He said, "Never bet against Americans, man. They look like a chaotic, screaming mess down there, but eventually they make the right decision and then they go in a direction and they act. Never bet against the Americans. Close quote. By the way, in not betting against the Americans, Dr. Peterson moved his family to Tennessee and then to Florida, most recently within the last few years. Now, he wasn't the first person from somewhere else to note the chaos of America. Alexander de Tocqueville noticed it many years before him, and of course wrote about the dangers of such a revolutionary fervor and what democracy might turn into, particularly in light of another revolution that was happening in another part of the world where guillotine was involved. The Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution have survived almost 250 years of good times, bad times, and even our own mediocre and unserious times. And the language of the Declaration of Independence, of course, has inspired revolutionaries and writers and, of course, leaders. Now, we are a leadership podcast, but we're also a literature podcast. And, of course, the Declaration of Independence is a great piece of literature. As a matter of fact, if you haven't listened to my full reading of it, which I release every July 4th, you should go do that. By the way, it's got a little Philip Sousa music behind it. Stars and Stripes Forever, I believe, is what it is. But I want to get Dorollo on because Dorollo's mind, the mind of a historian, the mind of a legal scholar, is going to look at this document through a little bit of a different lens. And so let's just start off with those first couple of paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. Where legally, well, no, let's start off with this. What can we take from the Declaration of Independence in the year 2024 with everything that we've got going on in our time? And by the way, this is the 248th year of the Declaration of Independence. 2026, if we make it that far and don't blow up the Republic, which that's always a risk. 2026 will be the 250th year of the Declaration of Independence. And I can't think of anybody more likely to put on a big show than Donald J. Trump without twerking or drag queens or story hours or any of that kind of nonsense, or, you know, a bunch of people telling us how terrible we are from the founding. So I think those are your two options, by the way, in the upcoming elections this year. So if you want a good party, 2 years from now, vote Trump. If you want something that's not a good party, vote for whoever's going to come out of that bacteria frap that they're working through over there in the Democratic Party. Well, with all that being said, what do you think of this document in 2024? What does this say to us now? Does it even have any meaning? Like, why are we even still bothering with this?
So you don't wish to talk about that segue from George Orwell's 1984, which was the COVID experience, to the Manchurian Candidate, which is our current electoral experience? Yes. So to answer your actual question,
turns out the truth is stranger than fiction, Dorollo.
Yes, but it really is. It really is. Didn't I read about this? No, it can't be happening. No. Didn't I read about this? And then you check what you read and discover, yes, you read about it, and their actual script or plan is even worse. And it's unfolding. Unlike the song, it's unfolding on television, right? Mm-hmm. The revolution will be televised, because if they don't televise it, they cannot inoculate, no pun intended, a population against the change being foisted on them. But yes, we can draw hope from this document, as very many Americans have throughout our history, and even in adverse circumstances, even when ostensibly they were challenging the system. And I think of two great Americans, my fellow Rochesterian Frederick Douglass, and I think of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to give him all of his names and titles, which I like to do. I'll just call him Dr. King. I didn't know him. He's too respectful for me for that. He's not merely just Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Martin Luther King Jr. He's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Anyway, both of them could look and did look to the Declaration of Independence as a document that told them how America should be. And then they could look at the status quo and recognize this is not how America should be. I read how America should be. I read the truths that are self-evident, just the way Thomas Jefferson stated them. Both points, that they're self-evident and that he laid out what they are, is plainly made aware to posterity, and was plain at the time what it meant. Several clues, both within the official text, which is Congress's version, as well as Jefferson's draft with his fabulous notes. And that's important for some of those detractors, whatever project they're calling themselves now. But it's important for the detractors because he said what he wrote, and the changes that Congress made to the document communicate that everyone understood what he said. And apparently it either was not politically expedient or enough people disagreed that they removed stuff that very clearly communicates an understanding of what was going on. And so I think that's important to raise. And so, in my opinion, thus, from both the end, reveled in the revolution, those, August men and women who actually 250 years later almost stood for, and people who love the country are ambivalent about the revolution because it didn't go far enough, and or decried the post-revolution attempts to preserve and extend a species of oppression that the original form of the document rightly decried. So I like that about the document, because I think they're documents to which people on two sides of an issue, two opposite sides of an issue, can look to and point to and say, see, I'm right. This is one of two very important documents. And the irony, of course, is the next one is the U.S. Constitution. But and there, the amendment process helps communicate, no, they meant what they wrote. That's why they did this amendment, because this is what they understood. But that reveals me as both an originalist and someone who is textualist as an attorney and as a constitutional lawyer in his analysis of that document. So yes, 2024. Oh, this is the DNA of our rebellions right here, and the justification for it. So it's right here, And so everyone is on notice because it's there. But anyone who loves freedom can draw hope from it. Anyone who loves freedom can draw hope from it. This is who cannot draw hope from it, okay? The petty tyrants, that's the worst sort. The big tyrants aren't the worst sort. You stop a big tyrant with a bullet. It's really simple, okay? Petty tyrants, you can't, because they usually are just a number or a cog, a number in a system, a cog in a wheel. They're a bureaucrat and a nameless, faceless Orwellian nightmare, to which, God willing, we will never wake up in this country and find, other than during that COVID disaster. Anyway, those tyrants cannot look at those petty tyrants, cannot look at the Declaration of Independence and take hope from that, draw hope from that. They have to be concerned, because they're reading the truth and knowing that this truth will embolden people. Now, I think, to actually analyze the text a little bit, one of the master touches of Thomas Jefferson, and when he wrote this, he was quite young. I believe he was 32 years old or something scary like that, okay? 32 years old, and his sense of human nature was strong enough and clear enough of a vision of human nature that he describes how most people behave. If this evil can be borne, we'll just tolerate it. We will hold our breath or bear down or whatever and just deal. And then one day and we'll praise God and move on. That's how most humans behave. That's how most humans survive. But a group of men and women decided 248 years ago that they were going to risk their fortunes and sacred honor, because they were not going to put up with this evil any longer. And, bravo to them. We have a country because of them. We have a country because of them. So, hope. one can draw hope, even if one is critical, even if one is justifiably critical of the status quo or the system in general. You can still draw hope from this document. Yet, if your business is about telling other people what to do and not giving them a choice, you should be concerned.
So you raised 2 points there that are very important, I think. One, Jefferson was 32 when he wrote this. That's almost like Michelangelo. I have a statue in my office of the Pietà, which Michelangelo carved when he was like 26, I think. Or Orson Welles creating Citizen Kane when he was 26. Like there's a certain sense that this document was one of those things that comes out of a young man, almost fully formed, right? A maturer, older man would not have penned these words. I don't know that Franklin, who was at least 15 years older than Jefferson at the time of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, I don't know that Franklin would have written these words. A much older man would have been a lot more conservative, I think, in their fervor. And so I take your point where, Jefferson had an understanding of human nature, but it was sharpened to the point of artistic grace in writing these words. Now, there's a couple of words in here that people stick on, and they always do stick on, and we're going to talk about those because you did mention Jefferson's notes. So originally, it wasn't, the line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of," not happiness, but the pursuit of property, right? Or the protection of property, right? Why? And then happiness is mentioned again, in talking about the securing of safety, and I'm sorry, not securing, but that whenever any form of government, to quote from
Yes,
the Declaration, becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it. Which, by the way, every revolutionary, every Patrick Henry type in America loves that line in there. And to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organize its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Happiness in 1776 meant something different than happiness in 2024, which will mean something different in if we make it that far, 2124. It'll mean something different then. And so why happiness rather than property? Property is a little more material, right? But happiness, that's ethereal. And by the way, the Declaration doesn't, and I tell this to my kids all the time, the Declaration doesn't say you're going to get happiness. It doesn't even say that you're going to come close to hitting the target on happiness. It doesn't even say that you have a right to have happiness engaged with you. No. No, the Declaration makes a bold assertion that the only thing you're guaranteed is the pursuit of it. That's it. If you get it, it's on you. If you don't get it, not to put too fine a point on it, but sucks to be you. We rub up against that. And so talk about that idea of happiness versus property. Like why were those words switched?
So it's interesting because I'm trying to nail down the exact quote, but in one of his treatises on government, John Locke has an expression that would have been familiar, in my opinion, to Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." That's a quote from John Locke, and it's not the one I'm looking for. It's just, I think it's one, I think it's from Locke. It's definitely Lockean, even if he didn't say it. And so I think the switch, and just to note, I use the text that's in Gary Will's book, Inventing America.
Okay.
Because he has a partly parallel text at the end. It's in an appendix or something that shows the version with Jefferson's notes, and then it shows Congress's version. But neither version shows the switch from property to happiness. And so with the text I deal with, it's just happiness. And I still think happiness is the better, I still think happiness is the better construction. I think it's the loftier construction. The only problem is when people either begin with this phraseology and then make an assumption, i.e., that there are no rights outside of the specific ones expressed herein, we can get into a problematic area because then they will deny property rights, right? I think that implied in what Jefferson wrote are property rights. I also know that this text is not the only place we need to look for rights or for human rights that are propositionally, expressed. This is not the only place we need to look. And so I don't have an issue with the use of happiness, but I still think it's a nobler construction because it shows that man as a creature has eyes and also has vision, that is trying to do something, that is going somewhere. He's trying to do something, he's trying to go somewhere. And it's inerrant in us that this is our framing, okay? That this is our MO as a species. And so, and as a creature, as a creation made in God's image, this is how we work. Just like he has vision, we have vision. There you go. So the pursuit of happiness implies that man will be chasing something or building something. And he has the right to do that. And I think that's beautiful. It expands the sphere of protected activity, arguably beyond mere property rights. And one of the things that used to happen in the English common law is very rote or mechanical thinking. And so if something wasn't written with the right words, it might be thrown out of court. Okay, what still happens now happens on technicalities now that deal with computer technology, and that is one of my bugbears, and it drives me up a wall. I'm dealing actually with it right now, frankly. But anyway, under the common law, though, it was still form over substance, but it was more form of how something was expressed rather than did you check the wrong box on another screen. Anyway, pursuit of happiness. I think it was brilliant, but yeah, there's no but. I think it was brilliant. But yes, it expands the sphere of rights. It shows that man is a creature with eyes in his head, but also with a vision in his heart, and that man will be pursuing that, and that he has the right to pursue that. And of course, I'm somebody who accepts that the use of man in this context implies women. As here's it's not a parallel text, but a text that was not much older, less than 200 years, about 150 years older than this, the King James version of the Bible.
Yep.
There are obvious passages, say in the New Testament, so the bit that was more recently written, talking to brothers and Christians would imply, oh, this applies to sisters also, meaning applies to women also. Statements about mankind as a species that Christians would know from the context, oh, this applied to both sexes and not just to one. And then there are other passages that apply to men, and it's the same word used in translation, by King James of Great Britain, his translators. But anyway,
right.
I think similarly here, it's 150 years later, I don't believe there was an intention here to deny women things. And of course, someone could show me, for example, from letters of pick a founding father. Well, let's pick Thomas Jefferson since he's the author. You could show me in his, correspondence that he meant something else. I would accept that. But until I'm presented that, that's not my conclusion. My conclusion, just here's the other analogous situation, analogous comparison. You don't see the word white in there.
No.
And one of the things progressives love to do is to say, well, he was talking about white men. He only meant white men. I think he meant what he said, and that's not what he said.
Right.
Further, that bit that was excised either because of political expediency or because it got voted down, which is not the same thing.
No.
The words he used there communicate quite clearly that he understood who was part of humanity and who wasn't. It was more usages than anything else that, in his mind, and I don't say entirely, I say mostly, usages in his mind that separated the civilized from the savage. And so, mostly usage. So, you know, masterly use of words and text, but yes, happiness. I think that was the right word choice. I think that was the nobler construction. And I think they would have been bogged down if he had said property, because when things weren't someone's property, the rights would have stopped literally at the border. Oh, is there a contract for this? No. Is there a charter for this? No. Oh, okay. Do you have a land grant for this? Otherwise, it's mine. So asserts, the King of Great Britain.
Right.
Versus the idea, hang on a minute, how did you get it? So you claimed using words it was yours, but we're here and you're not. We got here based on our own funds and you didn't give us anything.
Right.
We don't have to listen to you. We're just going to go and claim it as ourselves.
Right.
It's an empty forest. We're going to go claim it as ourselves, and did. And then started clearing the land. And then other people showed up and said, what are you doing in our forest? That part, at least, straightforward. But the notion that somebody across the water could claim something he never saw, that wouldn't even have been accurately represented on a map, because map making skills weren't there yet for things that they hadn't, didn't have a picture of, or an accurate picture of, maps they used to have, water passages all the way to India.
Right.
And India located out on a map, probably where China was, right. But it's a very important, I think it's an important point. So yes, I think he chose a nobler construction. I think it has greater utility in the law, certainly the law at the time. Yeah, it's exciting. I found this Churchill quote in research for this. Maybe I can find the Locke quote too. Yeah, there's another Locke quote where it's still not what I'm looking for, but here's the Churchill quote, which is really cool. Apparently he said, I think he said this in like 1919 or something, about the Declaration of Independence. He said, it is not only an American document. It follows on the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights as the third great title deed, and then there's the quote, that the liberties of all of the West were founded upon. And I find it a fascinating notion. And of course, that British statesman was half American. His mother was American. So go figure. And spent time in the U.S., almost got killed in New York on Fifth Avenue by a taxi. And so you think about how the worlds might have been different if the young Winston Churchill had been hit by a truck instead, or train, much more certain have died, and thankfully it didn't happen. But yes, seeing the words in the context of other words said by scholars or statesmen or others about the same issues, I think is important, because they don't exist in a vacuum.
Yep.
And so very Lockean, but with that twist that to me just opens up the whole horizon. Because if you're pursuing your happiness, what can't you do?
Well,
and there's a few things you can't.
You're right. There's a few things you can't. Yeah.
Yeah. And they didn't all agree on, legitimate uses of those rights. And certain places, certain colonies, let's put it that way, in America, were more adverse to, or more willing to take action against people whose happiness, in quotation marks, didn't conform with what the majority wanted. And of course, this is a species of tyranny. And this is a species of tyranny that de Tocqueville certainly foresaw. And you'll be happy to note that on my last trip to France, I actually picked up Tome 1, the first, le premier tome, the first volume in French,
Right.
because as a French speaker and reader and writer, I wanted to read this book
For quite some time.
I wanted to read what he actually said
Mhm.
instead of what he translated. He foresaw continuing racial difficulties in America.
Mhm.
And when is the last time we heard anyone say, "Oh, that's Tocquevillian"? Yeah. He made these observations and he said, "Oh, this is where they're going to struggle
Right.
perpetually into the future. They will struggle on this issue." Well, read what he said. It's there.
There. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
there, And he was saying it as a Frenchman. And that distinction matters because the way these different European nations that went out and colonized and encountered other peoples, they didn't all behave the same way.
Right.
The way the Portuguese behave and the Spanish and the Dutch, okay, and the English and the French wasn't the same. It just wasn't the same.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
happiness.
Well, happiness. Well, speaking of that, let's read from Mary Stockwell. She has her doctorate with the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Some of her commentary on Thomas Jefferson. Let's go to some commentary as we back up, or not back up, but move around this idea of what the Declaration of Independence is actually doing in its opening. And I quote, Martha Washington often recalled the two saddest days of her life. The first was December 14th, 1799, when her husband died. The second was in January 1801, when Thomas Jefferson visited Mount Vernon. A close friend explained, quote, she assured a party of gentlemen, of which I was one, that next to the loss of her husband, Jefferson's visit was, quote unquote, the most painful occurrence of her life. She had come to dislike Jefferson for his frequent attacks on President George Washington as a monarchist bent on destroying the rule of the people and a senile follower of the policies of Alexander Hamilton. Pause for just a moment here, proving that nothing that happens in an election year is new in America. Actually, we might be on better behavior than we were in the past.
Yes.
Back to Mary Stockwell. Jefferson even refused to attend memorial services for the president, saying in private that the quote-unquote Republican spirit in the nation might now revive now that Washington was dead and the Federalists could no longer hide behind his heroic image. Such animosity had not always existed between the two men. Instead, they were once friends who had much in common. Born in 1743, Jefferson, like Washington, was a tall redhead from the middling planter class. After attending William and Mary and studying law, he served in the House of Burgesses. He, too, raised his status by marrying a wealthy widow, Martha Wales Skelton. Jefferson considered himself a farmer and spent his life improving his plantations, especially Monticello, just as Washington cared for Mount Vernon. But it was in his devotion to the cause of the American Revolution that Jefferson most resembled Washington. As a member of the Continental Congress, Jefferson was recognized for his brilliant writing, expressed most clearly in the Declaration of Independence. He later served in Virginia's assembly, where he ended primogeniture, entail, and established religion, and then later became governor. Back in the Confederation Congress, he helped draft legislation that opened the West for settlement. And in 1784, he was appointed ambassador to France. Jefferson returned to the United States in November 1789 to serve as Washington's Secretary of State. His troubles with Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton began almost immediately. Pause once again. He of the Broadway play. I wonder what Jefferson would think about that. I think he'd probably be a little bit out of shape.
Furious. He'd be furious. Just too much.
He might take it a little bit poorly. I agree. Back to Mary Stockwell's analysis. He questioned Hamilton's plan for funding and considered the Bank of the United States unconstitutional. As the French Revolution grew more violent, Jefferson continued to support an alliance with France against Hamilton, who favored close ties with Great Britain. He even came to believe that Hamilton and his Federalists were bent on restoring a monarchy in the United States and that Washington had fallen completely under their spell. In 1793, Jefferson resigned from Washington's cabinet. Soon the leader of the Democratic Republican Party, he became vice president in 1796 and president in 1801. In his inaugural address, he called Washington, quote, "our first and greatest revolutionary character, whose preeminent services has entitled him to the first place in his country's love," close quote. Back at Mount Vernon, Martha Washington dismissed Jefferson's quote-unquote sarcastic remarks, claiming his election was the, quote, "greatest misfortune our nation has ever experienced," close quote. Jefferson served for 2 terms, with the 1803 Louisiana Purchase being his greatest accomplishment, before retiring to Virginia, where he died in 1826. A few things jump out, by the way. Thank you to Mary Stockwell from the Fred W. Smith Library on Thomas Jefferson. A couple of things jump out to me about that. Number one, presidential wives have always had opinions.
Mm-hmm. And always will.
Always will.
Most women with whom I enjoy having a conversation, and certainly the one to whom I am happily and of great blessing married, have opinions and will share.
And we'll share. And my wife is just like Dorollo's wife, not bereft of opinions herself, nor the ability to share them. So Martha Washington is just continuing a long tradition there. And then the other piece that you see there is that the beginning of, and we could talk a little bit about this, Thomas Jefferson really sort of began the whole partification of America. First with the formation of the Democratic Republican Party, and then, how sort of not Washington's followers sort of really kind of began to pull off, and you still had the Whig Party hanging out there and trying to figure out what was happening. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Whigs collapsed. The Whig Party collapsed almost 80 years later. And out of the ashes of the Whig Party rose the Republican Party, led by that hoary old gentleman, Abraham Lincoln. So the challenge of party politics, and you mentioned again, Thomas Jefferson was 32 when he penned the Declaration of Independence. The question I'm going to ask here is not the question that's on the paper. I'm going to ask the question. It's not the question in our script. Did Jefferson peak too early? Like, was 32 too early for him to peak?
Well, I mean, I don't think he peaked at 32. I think he performed well. I think he served our nation well. I think he, is one of the most critical of the founders. Now, there's certain things he wasn't good at, right? Mm-hmm. And so he was actually not a very good president. His first term was actually excellent, and his second term was terrible. Mm-hmm. And the misfortune of the second term among them is that it was second, and thus I think he did it with, he was brash, offensive. Let's just compare tempers. President George Washington's temper was literally legendary, and mm-hmm. every man in the room, even in the they were all afraid of his temper. His temper was legendary. And it is unimaginable today that anyone with a temper like that would get anywhere in the political party system that, I believe rightly you indicated, that Thomas Jefferson founded. Mm-hmm. So as a president, okay, first term was excellent, second term was horrendous. Mm-hmm. And if you remove the Louisiana Purchase from the first term, mm-hmm. all of a sudden it dropped to just kind of like, it's probably good. The Louisiana Purchase was legendary. Mm-hmm. He saw an opportunity and seized it, and he did something, and this is slightly controversial, okay? All of the greatest presidents will always find some constitutional boundary and transgress it for a purpose that is either high enough or deep enough or both to warrant that kind of transgression. Mm-hmm. And then afterward, they don't back up. And then the country evolves, as it were, okay? Mm-hmm. Jefferson did this. Washington did it before him. Jackson did it. Lincoln did it. FDR did it. They all found something and said, I'm just going to walk over that because X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. And we've gone on and survived. And it's profound, And so, what I'm speaking about with respect to Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase is what authority did he have to make that purchase?
He had literally zero
Exactly.
authority. You had none.
Right. And he did it anyway. And it was the right thing to do.
By the way,
he
and
saw
Hamilton probably would have yelled at him about that, by the way.
Yeah. But it was an epochal, epochal, epochal opportunity. And he saw it for what it was, seized it, and that was it. There was no going back. There was no undoing it. And then he, followed up. Oh, I'm going to send explorers and people who are going to chart it and whatever, because he literally saw the future. He saw the future. And he stepped into it, and he forced us to follow him into the future as he saw it. And they all do that. All the greatest ones do that. So, so it's interesting. I don't think he peaked too early. And in fact, he was among the longest lived of the founding generation. And as I'm sure you will mention it, well, you'll probably mention it at some point. So I won't steal your thunder. But basically, throughout that, duration, he kept up a voluminous correspondence, even into old age, something that that John Adams, thought was crazy. President Adams did not do that and knew, I think, as a very skilled lawyer, he knew how to put off, attention seekers or people even with earnest opinions with whom he did not wish to deal. And TJ, that was not his MO. He would literally respond and spend hours a day just on correspondence into old age. It's profound. But anyway, I don't think he peaked too early. Certainly not as an architect of our political party system. His political party still exists. They still exist. My political party was started in the 1850s. His political party was not, and it still exists.
Right.
And to me, that's genius. It's genius. And when you study the details, one of the things that's shocking, as you indicated, elections nowadays are tame. They are. And in part, it's because there's too many rules.
Right.
Anyway, back then, the stuff that they would do, it's basic. Okay, so basically, similar to British parliamentary elections of the time, who the elector, you're basically courting a fraternity, pun intended. And so there was the drinking and the shenanigans, just like with very many fraternities. And instead of charity that they're also doing to justify their existence, there was government. Even better, right?
Right.
Legitimate use of political authority in a coercive manner right after a frat party. Awesome. But anyway, that was literally the system. And so for Jefferson courting electors, it's like, great, we're coming to a park and here are the barrels of beer. You're going to drink all day and then we're going to take you to vote. Ding! Literally, it's literally how it functions. It's absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. But he was a master hand at that. And so many of the nasty tricks or tactics used today, he used. He knew how to use the media. He knew how to find proxies to voice his opinion. He knew how to cast shade. He knew how to do lots of stuff. And it's astounding, right? But to me, it shows that, politically, he was certainly a genius. He wasn't the best political leader, that's certain. But, he wasn't the best president. I don't know if he was the best governor of Virginia. He was a very good founding governor, though. He was very good himself with architecture. And so he understand how to set up the architecture of a state and did. One of his greatest works that's after the, Declaration of Independence was, his founding of the state of Virginia, basically, and then his notes on the founding of the state of Virginia. Yep. And so I don't think he peaked too early. I don't think he peaked too early. I just think that there were certain parts of politics that, because of his temperament, he was just bad at. And there are others whose temperaments were also not well suited for what they did, like an Adams, for example. Don't give that man his way. He's just a nightmare. Rather than someone who could say, okay, so let's make a deal. Wasn't who he was. That wasn't John Adams. With Jefferson, I don't know if that was the deal. He was actually good with relationships. It's interesting that of the founding fathers about whom the founding mothers spoke, Jefferson is one where they spoke about him, and it was literally like heaven or hell. It was either this is the most amazing man or this is the devil, and not anything in between at all. The only thing that is close in my recollection is how President Washington was universally lauded, universally lauded, and I think justifiably so. But after him, I think the one about whom they had the opinions, the founding mothers, it was Jefferson. And it was night or day. It was either sunshine or torrential or hurricane. Right? Yes, an angel or the devil. Oh, welcome. We're happy to welcome you back, or get the expletive off of my land. It was one or the other. And that was it. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't think we peaked too early.
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. Well, I think Jefferson probably had, other than the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition, which kind of both those things go together. And by the way, like to your point, I think that Jefferson recognized that not only could he double the size of the United States with a pen stroke, but that, and it's not recorded what he thought of Napoleon or Napoleon's negotiation skills or the reps from, but I think he probably thought he was helping the French out by giving them money, and he was able to get them out of his backyard. Because what a lot of people forget in the Louisiana Purchase deal was Haiti was also, a part of that, and the release of some of the other North American colonies. And at the time, no one knew how deep water a port New Orleans was. So now you've got a deep water port, you've got a navigable river, and you don't have to fight a bloody war against somebody who has clearly shown military acumen and is running over the British like nobody's business and giving them headaches all over the continent, and the Germans, the Prussians at the time, and the Russians and everybody else. And so, you're staying out of Europe's, business, you're doubling the size of the country. How is this a bad thing, right? There's no downside here. That was how I think he looked at the Louisiana Purchase. Yeah, but then, and I was actually talking about something.
His views of the West too, but I don't want to interrupt.
But I also think of his view of the Barbary pirates, and I think that people don't give Thomas Jefferson nearly enough credit. He read the Quran after dealing with a Congress that was consistently paying bribes to the Barbary pirates. He was like, we got to go to the root cause of this nonsense. And as a guy with a library who understood that your root causes could be in books, he read the Quran. It was like a comet hit him in the head. He goes, oh, wait, we're never going to be able to buy these people off. They're zealots and ideologues. That I understand. Let's get the Marines. Let's create Marines. And let's just go crush these people. then we'll just move on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because he's never given any credit for dealing with the Barbary pirates in that kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
But that put America on the Islamic culture's radar as someone not to be
Mm-hmm.
screwed with, as a country not to be messed with, which
Mm-hmm.
worked out really well for about 150 years. Worked out really well, actually, for 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, they were dealing with the Ottoman Empire and their own internal struggles with Islam and da 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 da. And then World War One would come along later on, much later on, and completely crack apart the Ottoman Empire, which is probably one of the greatest geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. Pache Vladimir Putin on the Soviet Union collapsing. But I think when you look at that's what Vladimir thinks was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, is the Soviet Union collapse. He's actually said that out loud.
Oh, I believe it. It's very self-serving.
Right, it is, and I don't agree with him. I think the Ottoman Empire collapsing is the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. That created all the problems that we currently have. Every single one of them, from Lawrence of Arabia all the way up to Hamas in Gaza on October 7th. Like, you don't get any of that if you have a solid power in the Middle East just holding everybody down. You don't get that.
Right.
And I think Jefferson understood that you're not going to hold those people down. You just have to smack them so hard they never come over to you and ask you for money ever again. And then you go home. And that created the Marine Corps. And, I'm going to give him credit for that. I'm going to give him credit for the Marine Corps.
I think, you know what, though? I think somebody just celebrated their birthday. I think they're actually older. He certainly deployed them. There's no question about that. I think they're actually older. I can't think of her name right now. Somebody I know on Facebook who's a Marine. She's she's a Marine. Once Marine, always a Marine. She's a Marine.
No,
but you're right. They don't give him credit for that. And it's also interesting because it's an example of a police action, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, anyone alive now who's not 50, that's basically all we know of the use of our military outside the United States. It's a bunch of police actions. What I mean by that are not wars declared by Congress, like the Constitution says. What you have is we sent troops somewhere. Oh, Congress authorized the money. It's still not the same thing. And so the recognition that, hey, this foreign policy thing here needs to stop. And the mechanism to stop it is to send men with guns.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sounds like war. No, we're just going to invade a place and shoot people up and then leave. It's not a war. Okay, TJ. Again, like the great ones, here's the constitutional line. I'm going to transgress it for this greater purpose, and I'm not going to back up or apologize.
Right.
Okay. And then there you go. It's really fascinating that it seems to be consistent with them doing stuff like that. But I digress.
Well, he went to the
credit. Yeah,
he doesn't get. Yeah. Well, he went to the root cause, and this is what I admire about Jefferson. He actually had the guts to actually read the words and take them seriously. Like, this is the only way. Only the writer of the Declaration of Independence, who believed the words he was writing, would understand the power of words and ideas to actually move people and change things. Mm-hmm. And that the people who are writing these words can actually mean them. So when I said in my opening that we currently live in a mediocre and unserious time, it's unserious because we're actually not taking seriously the words that people write. We're trying to find all these other meanings and behind what people say. No. Believe them when they say this thing. When they say, Allah Akbar, we want to kill you and we will spread our whatever, believe them. Like, why is this hard? This is not believe the Iranian mullahs when they say death to Israel. We want to blow them off the map. That's written into our charter. It's like why is this hard to believe? Why do we have to? But that's the curse of postmodernism, which I think Thomas Jefferson would have had no truck with whatsoever.
Correct. It's also, it goes against progressivist orthodoxy,
Right.
right? Various points of which include that people are racist because they're ignorant. You give them an education and they won't be racist. No, they'll be well-educated racists.
Right.
That's what you will find, that as time just goes on, racism will go away. Well, that's not how slavery ended.
Right.
Slavery didn't just go away until there was a lot of shooting and a lot of deaths, and it still didn't go away.
Right.
And then
Right.
there was a presidential fiat. Also, again, here's the constitutional line. He
Hmm.
transgressed it and didn't back down, right?
Hmm.
A destruction of a species of property. You got it. But upholding human dignity and finally setting free my ancestors. Awesome. They still had to change the Constitution.
Right.
So it still didn't end. It's this notion that I think it's chiefly the notion that, well, I'm not an extremist like them. They couldn't really have meant that. And of course, what that echoes for me is the first ever recorded word. Really what God said.
Yeah. Did God really say? Yeah.
It's familiar now, okay? But is that real? You think that they don't? You live in Disney World, you never experience, Disney World, of course, is my that's what I mean. And I know I've used it before. There's extremists of all sorts, very malign and malignant ideology. And yet, for progressives, it's just a question of time. This all magically goes away, and we become whatever we will self-actualize into, fill in the blank. Basically, a bunch of nonsense.
Hmm.
And so, the fact that TJ could be a hard-headed thinker, I think, is likable. I think it's important. I think it is something that amazes me. If you read the stuff he excised from the stuff he wrote in the Declaration that was excised about slavery, it's like, okay, let's back up. This didn't come from an abolitionist in Massachusetts.
Right.
The man who wrote it owned slaves till he died. He still wrote it, but he wrote it and he wrote it that way. And it's like, I don't know what to think now.
Right.
Now my breath's taken away. I don't know what to think. Was he that much of a tribune, that much of a prophet, that he could see it for what it was in its profundity over the whole system, and then yet human enough that not only did he not let any of his slaves go free, right, but he had his whole family. He had
Hmm.
his whole family in a very patriarchal sense. He had, this man, and I'm not the first person to use the following two metaphors, but he was an enigma. He was a sphinx,
Hmm.
and literally this man about whom the founding mothers said he's an angel or the devil, and that's it, and nothing in between. Nothing in between. I find that profound. That of course, Martha Washington had an opinion. I know Abigail Adams had opinions because she
Hmm.
wrote them to him.
Right.
She wrote the amazing, charming, relational leadership, because that's what I think he really had. Um, he was able to get back into the good graces of the Adams family and then regrow a friendship with his, erstwhile political rival, John Adams. Do you understand that? Like, I don't know how well, the late George H.W. Bush got on with the still existent President William Jefferson Clinton,
Hmm.
but the friendship between Adams, who then lost to Jefferson, that was actually a thing. And it's just like, it amazes me because it's unimaginable now.
Hmm.
Unimaginable. And remember, this is Jefferson of the dirty tricks, Jefferson of this newspaper is publishing libelous stuff. That
Hmm.
Jefferson,
Yeah.
yet they built a real, friendship, and then it crashed and burnt, and then they rebuilt it. And Jefferson seemed to be, um, you know, he seemed to, well, in my recollection, the way the particular book that I'm drawing from for these last comments,
Hmm.
um, the input from Adams is what I see more. It's Joseph J. Ellis' book about Thomas Jefferson, which I was reading from this July 4th. And so, yeah, so I see the Adams input, and I'm certain there was Jeffersonian input as well. But
Yeah.
but I find that fascinating, that they were able to do that, and that it's unimaginable. It's just not imaginable. It's not imaginable.
Well, because they
Yeah, it's
understood
just not imaginable.
something. Well, they understood something that's outside of, I think, our understanding today. And I don't know if it's because we haven't adapted appropriately our relationships to the presence of the immediacy of social media, or and that'll come along in time, or we are at a space of a poverty of spirituality, and poverty of Christian charity, which, by the way, yes, Jefferson was an atheist. Okay, so what? Like, and for him it wasn't okay, so what? It was a whatever. And I wouldn't even really say an atheist. He was more like well, anyway, he lived in a space where he wanted to he wanted to have his own personal relationship with Jesus without having that mediated by an institutional structure. And to your point, that is part of the dichotomies that existed inside of Jefferson. And we live in a space today where, because we don't have a core, or no, we don't have, our national core identity has so been damaged by progressivism over the last 100 years that we don't have an idea of how to build relationships with people outside of a political core identity, because we think that politics is the only thing that matters. And there's so much more to matter out of life. And Jefferson could do that, and that's how he could build something back better, to borrow a phrase, from John Adams.
From his political successor, yes.
Yeah. Than even maybe what he had, even what he had before. All right, let's turn the corner here a little bit. Let's talk about some of the other players that are floating around this year Declaration of Independence. Back to the Declaration of Independence, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of a king from the Declaration of Independence, and I quote, "He has refused to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation." Close quote. The he that Jefferson continually mentions here in the Declaration of Independence is, of course, the King of England at the time, King George III. And no matter what Hamilton the musical may tell you, King George III was not a simpering, prancing coward. He was not simping on Instagram or OnlyFans. That wasn't his deal. He oversaw the defeat of wars against the revolutionary forces of France, Napoleonic France, that started in 1793 and concluded in the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. He had a long career. In 1807, he oversaw the banning of the transatlantic slave trade from the British Empire. He had a moral core. But he was also proud, monarchical, and arrogant. And he knew what it meant to hold power because his family had held power in a world driven by monarchy. And fundamentally, even with all that, he was still pragmatic. And even at the end of a war, that such a declarative proclamation like the Declaration of Independence would create. By the way, this is an example of his pragmatism. He told John Adams, speaking of John Adams, the newly appointed American minister to London in 1785, and I quote, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power." Close quote. Sometimes when the war is over, you just got to make the peace and move on. And he got it. In the Declaration of Independence, his actions are described as tyrannical. Matter of fact, that's actually specifically described as tyrannical. And a lot of the things that are going to come later in the Constitution, particularly the elements that are reflected in the Bill of Rights, are going to come directly out of the list of usurpations and tyrannical acts that King George III is alleged to have put on the backs of the American colonies in their Declaration of Independence. And so, Dorollo, how do we look at King George? What can leaders learn from King George? Particularly about being gracious.
So it's funny because awesome. So yeah, we were actually just in England. We were in England a month ago. Had a great trip. Got to catch up with some friends. It was wonderful. But yeah, I lived there a bit during law school. There's politics and stuff in their history as an amateur historian. Is the comments in this document have been much more accurately stated about the Stuart kings prior to Cromwell's revolt. Okay. In contrast, post Restoration, post the Glorious Revolution, so called. Okay. Mm-hmm. Quotation marks, right? Air quotes. What are called, Whig ever afterward. Okay. It meant Parliament is supreme and the king is not. It meant that even where the king is running his government from day to day, as King George III would have done, there's really a lot going on in Parliament that is actually driving things. And so that's obscured in the usage here. Now, rhetorically, and certainly in terms of advertising, TJ did the right thing. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier for people to focus on one man who is evil than focus on a body of men of changing composition whom they do not know, who are really bad guys. That doesn't really work rhetorically, and it doesn't work morally as powerfully as that's the man. Mm-hmm. Get it. And so that's effectively what he did. And so the first thing that strikes me is knowing their system, knowing that, okay. You haven't said anything about Lord North, the prime minister, the one who was literally behind creating and passing these obnoxious policies like the stamp and things like that. Those didn't come from King George III. Mm-hmm. He signed the royal assent. Right? But right. He didn't draft them. They weren't even his ideas. They were Parliament's ideas, and not all of Parliament, because the American colonies had partisans in Congress, had people there who supported the Americans' views on English liberties. Mm-hmm. Okay? the ancient liberties of England, however you wish to express it. The American colonies had friends in Parliament. And until war actually started, there were powerful voices calling for restraint, calling for compromise, calling for coming arriving at a solution that the American colonies with, and Lord North was not those people. And so there you go. And so that's what strikes me first. When you understand their system, you see that there's a lot of, there's a lot of advertising going on here, rather than, an accurate description of King George III was fomenting. Now, was he responsible? Yes, that's what it meant to be king. It's what it still means to be king. And rightfully so, and his feet. Now, there's a subtle point in terms of the difference between the British system and the American system at the time. As this document recognized, the king did have a role in the American colonies. Okay. He was the sovereign, but in a system that had to recognize representation, okay, had to respect the laws that the lawfully elected representatives passed. And of course, remember, he had to give his royal assent, but had to respect the law and had to respect due process. This is what the Magna Carta was about. This is what the Bill of Rights from 1627 was about. Okay. And so there was a constitution, small c, in place, and there was a system in play. And so many of the not many, but some of the criticisms can be laid at his feet because they involve more wrongs that where he, in my opinion, is legitimately responsible rather than Parliament. So some of them do, but there's subtleties in their play, and greet them, and then you would a little England working as ordered. As a professional historian who wrote a book called American Nations. And one of the things that he talks about in his book, the premise is that there was more than one American founding, that there was about 13 of them, and not because of the colonies, but because different populations came in at different times with different ideas. And different ideas about, among other things that are relevant to this conversation, about freedom and liberty. And as you study that and then study, for example, what happened in Maryland and in Virginia in those two colonies while there was a civil war going on in the UK in the 17th century, so the century before. I didn't know that there were things like battles that happened on this continent during that war because of partisans here having certain ideas. I didn't know any of that until I read his book. And so that was absolutely fascinating. But basically, in a sense, we've got the wrong guy, but he's the guy you want to paint in those colors because you can't do it more accurately with Parliament because that would just never sell. It would never sell. Okay. And yet some of that could be blamed on this king. And what he really needed to do was just act like a king. Show up, do your tour. Like what do they do today? And not just in Canada, but in the United States. Show up, do a fabulous tour. There's a parade. Everybody loves you. Hand out some titles. I'll make you the Lord of Maryland. I'll make you the Baron of, Broome County or whatever. And Americans would have eaten that for breakfast, certainly in the South, would have eaten that for breakfast.
Oh, yeah.
And the New Englanders would have been furious because the part of England from which most of that DNA came from was very commercially viable, very independent. We're talking the East Anglia. And so a little bit northeast of London up to the Humber. And so places like, including cities like Boston, Lincoln, these are in the UK. These are in East England, okay? Norfolk, right. These are in East England, okay? Those people would have been furious, justifiably so. But that was their DNA and their culture, which helped inform their ideas in New England about, kings and all of that. And so it's interesting that for a Southerner, Thomas Jefferson was remarkably anti-monarchical.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Remarkably.
so the vast majority of the southern United States, talking about what was settled and what wasn't, the vast majority of the southern United States was settled by folks that came out of that Scottish tradition, right? And Scottish and Irish tradition.
Mhm.
And the folks that came out of the Scottish and Irish tradition had a long history of, I mean, going back well into the Middle Ages, and even before that, into the time of the Roman Empire, of fighting pitched battles with the English over who was going to rule, who was
Over
going
land.
over land, right? The principle
Yep.
of land, right? Which is why coming to North America, and you know, I have sometimes explained this to people, they didn't view, not even that. I'll frame it this way. This is why when they came to America and they discovered that there were already people living here, um, they had such pitched battles with those folks
Mhm.
because they had been living in a paradigm of warfare for land-based freedom for at least 500 years. Yeah, at least at a minimum, right? And so you can't take that away. And then you combine that with a sense that I am now here, this land is empty. I came out of a long history of Scottish rebellion, and now I'm going to set up this thing the way I'm going to set it up. And no one can tell me what to do, which is what made the slavery process so problematic, I guess is the term that I'll use, starting in Virginia and then moving its way all the way into Georgia and then Mississippi and Alabama. And then also it's what made the Civil War a little bit later on, 80 years on later, such a apocalyptic war, because how do you crack a mindset like that? How do
Mhm.
you even impact a mindset like that? Well, it's just like Jefferson dealing with the Barbary pirates. Like you have to punch it in the mouth directly, and you have to understand
Mhm.
what it is directly. And by the way, you can't just punch it once. You got to repeatedly like hit on it until it breaks. And it is
Mhm.
only, I would assert that the last bit of Scottish rebellious aristocratic thinking probably went out of the American South in the late 1990s, and as soon as the late 1990s. And I would even assert that some of it's still there, even still, which is what scares everybody half to death when they talk about Civil War. Um, okay, the king didn't behave like a king, or the king should have behaved like a king.
Right.
Um, King George's pragmatism, because he struck me as being a kind of guy who was like, okay, if the fight's going to happen, and I've run into guys like this before and I always mention jujitsu once a podcast, so I'll mention it now. You always want to get across guys like this in jujitsu where, we're going to be friends off the mat. That's fine. We can go hang out. We can go whatever. But if we're going to bump fists, like, okay, I'm not your friend anymore. Like we're getting into this. And whatever
Mhm.
happens, happens. And
Mhm.
you're coming out of a wrestling background, this. Whatever happens, happens. But then, like, when we're done, we're done. Like, we leave it here. And
Mhm.
King George III impresses me as being that sort of fellow.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's ironic because I think there's there are several layers of irony for it for me. One, um, the man was straight up German. Okay,
Right.
his grandfather, no, I think it was his great grandfather, because there's at least one generation skip in the Hanoverian monarchs. But the
Mm-hmm.
first Hanoverian monarch, King George I, didn't speak any English. Okay, he's in England. He's also king of Hanover, which is in Germany. It's in northern Germany, south of Denmark, and that part of Germany, and not directly south. That's Schleswig-Holstein, south of there. Anyway, so George I didn't speak English. Enough said. Next, George II, okay, antagonistic relationship with his father, George I, okay, also probably didn't speak much English, spent time in Hanover, blah, 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 okay. Then his son, who's the father of George III, died, then you have George III, okay. And so I believe he was the first Hanoverian monarch actually born in England. What strikes me here is that, in my opinion, that's a very English characteristic, okay, that we play the game, we play by the rules. And then when we're done, we can shake hands and we can go, have a beer. Like, that's very much them. Okay. There are ways in which we as Americans act similarly, but they're noticeable distinctions. I think we Americans are more concerned, frankly, with winning than with playing by the rules. To us, it is not a point of pride that we played by the rules and lost.
Right.
Right. We won. Excellent. If we played by the rules, is a secondary consideration. And I'm not saying that's better. I'm just saying that is more us, okay, versus them. I think it is very much a characteristic of theirs to play by the rules.
Right.
And of course, what does that come from? That comes out of a social elite there who owned and ran everything, but also who created the due process we know of in our own country. And so when they're saying you have to play by the rules, what they're really saying is due process matters. That's what they're actually saying. And so it's just due process matters as applied to sports, due process matters as it applies to marriage, due process matters as it applies to everything. And so to me, that is very, very, very English. And so to find King George III, of all people, Farmer George, that was his nickname. Okay.
Right.
And he loved farming. Like, that was his thing. I had a massive family. I think he had 16 kids from one wife, Farmer George and the whole crew. It was a serious working farm. But it is very, very English. And so I find that striking, I think that pragmatism. Okay, so leadership. Can you keep your eye on the big picture and also play really hard, but by the rules? I think that gets you further, okay? And will inspire people following you better than, just dispensing with the rules left and right, obviously. I don't know how long people are going to follow you without stabbing you in the back if you show that you don't care what the rules are. Especially the rules that you set,
Right.
Also there's some letting your underlings run everything. Because as I said, about 10 minutes ago, and if he wouldn't have had of America, listen to what the issues. And I don't know how Parliament would have responded if he created these little parliaments and recognize that they should be independent, that the American colonies could come within the British Empire without being under the thumb of Parliament. It's a subtlety that's there that I don't think U.S. history class prepares American students for.
Yeah.
Because yet it was the reality. Okay, Parliament, for example, didn't legislate for India. That didn't happen. Okay, and why would it? It's not England, it's India. Oh, okay. Well, then how are laws being made in India? That's a separate issue that could have been dealt with and was there dealt with differently. And so, and dealt with in a really, really weird way until about 1858. But, part of the fascinating thing about studying the actual British Empire, it's like no other empire I've ever studied, because there's so many different models that some of them are still in existence right now. Okay. Gibraltar, okay, right now doesn't function the same way as the Isle of Jersey. Okay. But neither of them are Great Britain, and yet they're still under British sovereignty.
Right.
They're islands in the Pacific, as far as I know. They're still British possessions. Okay. I think that place they sent Napoleon, I think Saint-Domingue, I think that's still, it's in the middle, it's in the South Atlantic.
Yeah.
Right. So, so many different models. And this is what's really exciting. Okay. Because while I'm a fan, that's the wrong word. That's bad diction. While I think it's important to call out British colonialism for its abuses, injustices, errors, genocide, whatever happened to be the case in the particular circumstance, I also think it's important to recognize a few things that they did that were great. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the fascinating things that they did that was great is so much of how their colonialism worked. It was not a state enterprise, it was private enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's exciting because it shows that there's a way forward that works where normal people, you and I and others, can take the fruits of our labors and put them in a business venture and literally found a state.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked really well and it still be in existence. And that's what's scary. And when the crown was doing its job, they would then declare sovereignty over the entity and then just let it continue. And it worked marvelously. And when it failed, okay, well, when it failed, arguably what the crown then needed to do was figure out, well, why is this failing? Like, what's the deal here? Okay, like India, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the deal here? Well, the deal here is you have more and more people coming over from the UK, and they have these strange notions about these brown people who are around here.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, the racism hardened and went further and further widespread until what progressives would say was inevitable, but I won't say is inevitable, happened. I.e., you had a nationalist movement that was born because these people in their own land were tired of having these foreigners telling them what to do and making them do weird things like cut their toenails and do whatever else. Like, in other words, if they had a modicum of justice, if a crown had showed up and said, no, you're all equal under the law, just like in England, you're equal under the law here, which means that I will enforce the laws against you for their rights over there. All of a sudden, you still have a British India.
Mm-hmm.
You would have a very different society, in my opinion, but you still have a British India.
Yep.
And why don't we have a British India today? Because they refuse to deal with that injustice. That's why, period. That's it. And so, therefore, all of the good that was done, the roads, the hospitals, all of this stuff that was done, the ending sati, the stopping thuggee, and these other practices from Hinduism, where if you just read what was being done and then just be honest with yourself, you say, yeah, that was actually pretty horrendous. Okay, I'm glad they stopped it. Wonderful. That all gets suborned to the narrative of the inevitable rise of the nationalism, and I get it. I get why it had to happen. I don't fault them for doing that. I fault the crown because they let things get to that place where then this was inevitable and necessary. And ironically or not, read the Declaration of Independence. You read that, you can see it coming. Okay, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well.
Why can't I make my own salt?
Yeah.
Whose idea was that? But the sea is right there. Why can't I make my own salt? No. Nope. No thanks. Goodbye. Boom. Yeah. And now, the largest democracy on the face of the earth.
Right.
Wouldn't have happened if the British weren't there.
Right.
Yep. Would not be a democracy right now. They weren't a democracy before. Now, here's the irony, because Indian history is actually something I study. It's really fascinating. There actually are Republican antecedents that are like around 2,000 years old. Really, really fascinating stuff to study. But so did the potential exist for that to develop? Sure it did. But what I noticed is between then and, the 20th century, you didn't have it.
You didn't have it.
So it's just like, okay, so you had about 2,000 years for that to, and it didn't. Unlike in Greece, where it only took about 300-400 years to go from monarchy to functioning republics. It only took about 200 to 400 years, and not uniformly. That never happened in Sparta. It never happened. Okay, it happened in Athens and a few other places, but and then, of course, it being ironic that the first Greek empire, it was an Athenian empire, right?
Of course.
So
Yeah.
here we have our democracy, but we're oppressing those people over there, right? But anyway, I digress. Yeah, George III leadership. Don't let your underlings run the system. But oh, by the way, you can have, you can have a venture that is private, that works, that inspires, that is run, that is started by, run by, and empowered by normal people, and it will inspire other normal people to show up and want to not just build their own thing, but work together. And then that's not the level where it matters most. It's now we're sacrificing what is ours to achieve this common good. Okay. We're putting at hazard our fortunes, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Right.
Yep.
So here's how I'll end on this point. So I was just in England a month ago. One of the photos I took, I was walking on by Whitehall. Okay. I was actually at Whitehall, and I wasn't in Whitehall, since Whitehall is still a functioning government set of buildings, excuse me. But I was walking by, and there's a placard on the wall, and I took a photo of it. And I love this. Okay. And remember, I want people to hear me. Okay. I'm not saying that any of the abuses were good or that they should have been tolerated. I'm not saying that. Okay. I'm just saying there's something remarkable in how some of these British colonies were started and then grew. And they're lessons for the rest of us that we can learn by studying them. And where the heck did it go? I don't even know. It's not even the right year. That doesn't make any sense. All right, here we go. So where are my photos from London? All right, here. Yes. Yeah, there's a great quote by on water. Get into any copyright issue. Where is? But it's brilliant. Give me a moment. I will find it.
Sure.
I also took photos of various memorials I found where there were different peoples who were thanking, the British for the stance they took in fighting alongside them or giving them asylum during World War II. And I found it highly moving. We live in an age where people are more likely to take apart a statue, than put one up. Yeah. And so it's fascinating to see these various memorials, quite moving. I found it. Canterbury Province, New Zealand. Quote, in March 1848, on this site, formerly 41 Charing Cross, the Canterbury Association met and planned the settlement of the province founded on the 16th of December, 1850 by English settlers led by John Robert Godley. So what the heck was that? Who knows? Just a normal person who founded a colony that still exists. Part of the nation of New Zealand. God save the king.
Average people.
I was going to say God bless America, but I'm like, yep, that doesn't work in this context. So what's the analog? Vive la France. God save the king.
Yeah. Well, it's average people being empowered to behave heroically, right? And that's also something that you get from the language of the Declaration of Independence. Let's turn a corner here. Let's wrap this up. Let's continue through the Declaration of Independence, and let's explore some more of this language. And let's pick up with some more of these usurpations and, tyrannical acts that Jefferson is listing here. And I quote, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretend offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely parallel to the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And I'm going to round the corner here. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We've reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We've appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And they weren't kidding neither. The vast majority of the signers of the Declaration of Independence wound up either bankrupt, on the run, some of them caught bullets, and at least a few of them lost their families. They lost everything. Some of them did lose their lives. Some of them did lose their fortunes, but not one of them lost their honor, and not one of them recanted. Not one of them went back. Highly unusual in the history of the world, particularly around revolutions of the Marxist type in the 20th century, as a counterpoint to what is being declared here. Apocryphally, Benjamin Franklin noted that we almost hang together or we should all hang separately. And even though the delegates to the Continental Congress didn't complete the signing of the document until 1781, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were all in, one way or another, by hook or by crook. This is a question that I've often wanted to ask Dorollo, and it'll be the question that sort of closes out our time here today. What is the likelihood that the Founding Fathers would have been hung for treason if they had lost the war?
I think it was high. I think it was high. Do I think some of them would have been pardoned? Without a doubt. The reason I say that is because there's a certain level of, the best description, of course, is the word corruption, but there's a certain level of corruption that worked within British government such that somebody with enough money, I'm certain, would have been able to get a pardon or get some kind, and not through King George III, through Parliament, okay? Because he would have paid his factor, meaning his personal agent in London, enough money to then get to somebody in Parliament to say, hey, this person needs to be pardoned. And then there'd be a bill and it would be passed because this person owed me favors, this person. That's how it worked. So I'm certain that not all of them would have hanged, but certainly the chief ringleaders would have hanged. And John Hancock really would have hanged. Okay, he would have been hanged, drawn, and quartered. And actually, probably that's what would have happened. You only hang spies. They literally would have pulled them up. They're almost dead, cut them down, and then slit out their entrails and pulled It's bloody awful. Okay, that's what they would have done. Put the head on a pike, and said, here you go. You rebel against us, this is what happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it. That's why we won, because that wasn't going to happen. That was not going to happen. And it's interesting because the multi-ethnic character of that fight is really fascinating to observe. And of course, some of this, what has been known relatively from the beginning. For example, one of the first Americans you ever learn about in social studies class,
right,
circa third or second grade, was a free gentleman named Crispus Attucks.
That's right.
Who was shot by the British in Boston.
Yep.
Okay. American patriot. Yeah. I think they would have, certainly the ringleaders would have been hanged, drawn, and quartered. End of story. We learned that one of the first cases you learn in law school, in Crim 101, is called Queen v. Dudley and Stevens. Queen was Queen Victoria. So this is after the era that we're talking about, in very many respects, after the era. So these are people who progressives would say, oh, should have been further forward. These were certainly people who had a better certainly their elites had a better moral grasp of what was going on than did the elites during the Hanoverian or Georgian, era. Mm-hmm. But Queen v. Dudley and Stevens is about what happens when you're on a boat and you run out of food and you decide that two of us need to kill the third guy and eat him, literally. Okay? And then what happens when your boat then wanders around and then you guys actually get rescued and then somebody decides to squeal. So they find out, oh, you guys killed and ate somebody. So what did they do to them? Well, they prosecuted them and then we're going to execute them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what you do, right? Oh, so you were starving on a boat, you killed and ate somebody. That's murder. That's murder. Oh, okay. And so literally, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm correct in the conclusion, because it will obviously kill it, no pun intended, if I'm wrong. Okay. But
well, and the thing is, like, these guys understood who they were dealing with in a really material way. Yeah, go ahead. In a really material way.
I got it. They were sentenced to death. Queen Victoria herself commuted their sentences to 6 months. So there was some humanity in it. But you notice that the British legal system tried, convicted, and condemned these men to death. And of course, they murdered the man.
Right.
Story. That's actually the correct process. It's just, I think it's easy to understand the humanity of it and easy to feel some level of empathy. And also what I find laudatory is that British sense of, remember, it's about the rules and fair play. And this is not according to the rules, right?
Right.
So there you go.
Well, you talk about
go get hung, drawn, and quartered.
When you talk about the rules and you talk about fair play, it's interesting to me because I remember the movie Patton, where George C. Scott stands in front of that giant American flag at the beginning. And he says, I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. And that's a very American, to your point, that's a very American concept, right? And one of the things that has struck me over the course of doing this podcast over the last few years has been reading various books and, of course, reading papers and reading great writing. When you read the American portion of the Western canon, the sense that you get from the American portion of the Western canon is that we are the last inheritors of the sense of argumentation that has existed in the West going all the way back to even before there was a conception of the West, right? So you want to talk about Magna Carta, which was to a certain degree influenced by the Crusades, right? This idea that we are going to argue at Vienna all the way to the Ottomans showing up before we light the trebuchet to launch the rotten heads at the Islamic invaders, we're going to argue about it in the West. And by the way, we're damn near going to have fist fights with each other about this. But the second that we decide, to Jordan Peterson's point that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the second we decide, click, we're all going in one direction, like that's it. Like it's done. And one of the interesting things is over the last 80 years, with the rise in sort of what I call unserious people being allowed to be in power and being allowed to have a voice, the democratization of unseriousness, if I were to coin such a phrase, has allowed people who don't want to click together more space to speak and more space to have their ideas or their lack of their internal rebellion revealed, right? And this is where you get all the isms and the ologies that have bedeviled us ever since the end of World War II in the West. Mm-hmm. But there is still a fear, and it is a legitimate fear, and I think it's a fear that exists in the other alternative poles of culture in the world. So you talked about India. I think of China. The reason that the Chinese stopped, no, that's the reason. The only way the Chinese were able to stop the opium trade was to boot out every American and Brit they could find. That was their only solution to the problem. And by the way, that's been their continued solution to the problem even now. Get them out. Islam knows, I mentioned them several times today on the podcast, but they know as a philosophy. That's why there's a reason the Iranians call America the Great Satan. There's a reason why. And it's not because Satan deceives, it's because Satan seduces. It's the seduction of this idea of argumentation all the way to the end of something. It's the seduction of rebellion. And the other major poles of civilizational construct on the planet know just how, I think, seductive that idea can be. And we have in America perfected that. We've sharpened it to its logical conclusion. We've gotten it to probably its end point. Which, by the way, presents problems for us here in America and in the West in general, because if you can never click together, you can't get anything done. If that click sound doesn't happen, you can't move forward. Now, with that being said, I think the click sound has happened, but I don't think it's happened in the places where it traditionally would have happened over the last 500 years in the West, which was in the political realm, and in the economic realm. I think now that click sound is beginning to happen more and more often in the social and cultural realms. And that is a sea change in the West. I don't think that we're prepared for that yet, or the implications of that. And I'm not quite sure that a socio or cultural West that's not driven or where politics and economics are still the candy-coated shell on top of society and culture, where society and culture gets to push up through that and gets to mold that, it gets to shape that, it gets to move that around like tectonic plates. I'm not quite sure that we in the West are ready for the implications of that, because that click sound is going to take a heck of a lot longer to happen. And when an existential threat does show up, which it always does, and by the way, climate change is not an existential threat. Like, I'm not talking about something that's like globally so big that it becomes almost a substitute for the transcendent. I'm talking about when real human beings with real guns and real bombs and a real desire to genocide you show up. Mm-hmm. The West is in a particular point now where there's just no click sound on what to do about that. Mm-hmm. At all those four levels that I mentioned: political, economic, cultural, and social. And I used to think that was a bug in the system that needed to be eliminated, but more and more I'm beginning to believe that is a feature of the West and of America in particular. And this Declaration of Independence, the reason why we revere it so much is not because it describes quote unquote democracy or quote unquote a republic, or because it is conservative in its leanings. It's because it's a definitive click sound where it says we're all gonna, to Benjamin Franklin's point, we're all gonna hang together, or we're all surely gonna hang separately. So you either get on board, or we're leaving you behind. And by the way, a bunch of people who did get left behind, just to point this out, when the Revolutionary War did start, the loyalists all ran to Canada.
or went to England, like Franklin's son, one of his sons, William Franklin, went to England, and that was that. They're probably still alive. In fact, on the Strand in London, I have a photo from some business, and I took it because, you know, it's just, there's things that they don't tell you or show you in school, and I just get a kick out of when you come across some of them, like that name. We know Franklin from Ben Franklin, but how many Franklins are there still who are still around in the UK? There's Franklins, right. They're around. Yeah, so I found this business on the Strand. Yes, J and S Franklin Limited, 151 the Strand. London, W, whatever, W1, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So I have no idea who they are. I don't know what their business is. But when I saw it, I took the photo because what it made me think of course, is, oh, well, William Franklin went over there. Maybe these people are his descendants. That's actually a possibility.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's something that President Washington said in his farewell, right? Talked about how no alliances are permanent. Part of that sentiment, it's the other side of the coin. It's that the real antagonisms are temporary, you know, and especially if fought well, okay? Because some of our greatest allies are the Germans and the Japanese. We fought them to the death. No, sorry. We fought them to surrender.
Right.
We did not fight them to the death. That was an ethic coming out of their cultures, but not one that came out of this culture. And I think that we're all benefiting from that. You know? Yeah. If I were speaking directly to them, I don't think there's any shame that they would need to feel today over the fact that we beat them. Thank God we beat them.
Yeah, I think they would.
Then we could be magnanimous and help them grow. You know,
right.
Then we could be magnanimous and help them grow. And also the evil they were doing, we put to an end. So there you go. You know?
The greatest thing that came out
and if it's us one day, what should we hope for? You know, the right kind of enemy.
Well, the greatest thing that came out at the end of World War II was Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the United States and what was left of Europe, including de Gaulle, who, as I said on this podcast before, Truman thought was psychotic, sat down. I always have to point that out. De Gaulle and Churchill, Stalin didn't get invited to Bretton Woods, but, you know, we all sat around in the West and said, how are we going to construct a world order where everybody gets to play fair, to your point about British law, where everybody gets to play fair and according to the rules. And instead of taking your territory, we as Americans are going to allow you, and this was the key term, this is the key idea that came out of Bretton Woods, we're going to allow you to sell to us everything you have and twice on Sundays. As a matter of fact, we'll go a step further. This was a little bit later, but we'll go a step further and we'll start sending you the factories that make the things you sell us. And some kid in Indiana can take it in the neck for the next 3 generations so that your economy can get better. But we'll never get a thank you for Bretton Woods. Matter of fact, all we will get is reprobation for anything that for all the negatives that came out of Bretton Woods up to, I mean, the Korean War, Vietnam War, globalization, all of those kinds of things. The positives are never acknowledged when it comes to that, because the United States was just expected 80 years later to behave like a magnanimous father. And there was nothing in the history of the world that indicates that the United States had to behave that way. As a matter of fact, when the Europeans and to a certain degree the Japanese showed up at Bretton Woods, they were in shock that the Americans behaved not like old school colonialists, but instead behaved as if they were building and this will be the first time I say these words on the podcast, as if they were building a new world order, an actual new world order.
Mm-hmm.
That only
Mm-hmm.
comes out of a people who have been marinating in freedom, that where the cornerstone of that was set by these words here in the Declaration of Independence. I think we pulled this apart today. Any final thoughts on the Declaration of Independence, Dorollo? What can leaders learn from this document? What can they take from the Declaration as a mission statement, as a vision statement? Actually, it's a vision statement, because the mission statement is really the Constitution. This is a vision statement. What can leaders take from this vision statement? Particularly the 32-year-olds that are out there. The 32-year-old millennials. The 32-year-old millennials are on TikTok. What can they take from this now?
But see, de Tocqueville would not have been surprised by that. And
Right.
he wouldn't necessarily have been troubled by that, I think, either. I don't know how Jefferson would have felt about it, but he would have written back to them. He would be on there tweeting all day. He would have lost his mind, because he'd be, what do you do all day? I just tweet people. I tweet back to people with their questions. I just tweet all freaking day on X all day. But yeah, there's so much in it. It's so nuanced. I definitely recommend reading the excised bits, because there's still that bit on slavery is probably the best indictment of slavery in American letters, period, before the Civil War era, period. It's fabulous. Now, the simplest and most elegant would be what the Quakers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania said in 1712, which was the first public protest of free people against slavery in the Atlantic world, as far as I know. And it's just really straightforward, just straightforward Christian principles. And there you go. It can be said in a sentence or two, and that's it. Unlike, this majestic flowing wave of prose that is meant to carry with it the sense of the overwhelming evil of slavery, the sense of the hypocrisy that this is what a Christian king was fomenting. The word is literally italicized in the notes. It's brilliant. So yes, no, I love this document. I love that our country was founded with such a piece of words. But it does beg the question, how do you hold together a nation that no longer can agree about why we exist, what we're meant to do? We had so many differences, and we adhered fine. I remembered again why I brought up Crispus Attucks. There were other Black men who fought, and certainly fought later, and were in revolutionary armies, even against the objection of that great American George Washington. Still ended up bringing in Blacks. Okay, rightfully so. And what I'm talking about, though, is what were their motivations? If you just got freed, why aren't you trying to get as many goods as you can and head as far west as you could, away from all these people
right? Yeah.
who tolerated all this nonsense? Why weren't you buying a ship and sailing back to Africa? No, you were getting a gun and joining neighbors who didn't free you to fight for freedom. Wow. What does that tell me about freedom? What does that tell me about this great nation? Very good things, very good things, very good things. So, Declaration of Independence 2024.
And with that, I'd like to thank Dorollo for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. And as I usually say at this point, well, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.